Well, I'm going to go ahead and start since we only have an hour and we want to make sure to use all our time. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon or this morning, depending where you're located. This is the second webinar in a four-part series with editors of and contributors to the new volume, American Revolutions in the Digital Age, published by Cornell University Press in 2024. You can find a link, we'll drop it in a second in the chat, to this text, which is available open access. I'd like to begin by noting that this session will be recorded. By staying in the webinar, you're giving permission to be recorded. My name is Eleanor Mahoney. I helped organize this event in my capacity as National Coordinator for the Mellon Humanities Postdoctoral Fellowship Program, along with Perry Meldon. To learn more about this program, we'll drop a link in the chat as well. I also serve as Associate Editor for the Living Landscape Observer, a newsletter and website that is supporting this event too. Closed captioning is available during this session. To turn captions on or off, you can click on the icon at the bottom of the screen that reads Show Captions. Our session today is 1 hour and will run from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time. The first 40 minutes or so will be a moderated discussion. Around 3:40, we'll open it up to your questions and comments. If you'd like to pose a question for the presenters to discuss, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen at any time during the event, and we welcome any questions. Another way to participate is by clicking the chat icon at the bottom of the screen, which looks like two speech bubbles. You can write comments there to exchange ideas with other audience members or the panelists. To make sure your comments are visible to everyone, if that's what you would like, be sure where it says to in the chat box to click panelists and attendees, or you can select just panelists if you'd like the message to go only to the panelists. We encourage everyone to actively participate through the chat and Q&A, but we ask that you keep your comments respectful and on topic. And if you want to test it out, feel free again to put your name and where you're joining from. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Jessica Dautrive, to introduce this session and our invited panelists.
Thanks, Eleanor, and hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Dautrive, and I serve as the Digital Humanities Consultant for the ACE Fellowship Program. So I'm really glad to see everybody here today and grateful to these panelists for being here. As Eleanor mentioned, this is the second session of a four-part series. So if you missed the first one, I would encourage y'all to go back and view the recording, which we have linked on the Living Landscape Observer site that I just posted in the chat. It was a really great conversation to sort of ground this four-part series. And I'm thrilled to introduce our panelists for today's session, Public History at Historic Sites. We'll start with our moderator, Dr. Mark Boonshoft. Dr. Boonshoft is an associate professor in Conrad M. Hall 65 Chair in American Constitutional History at Virginia Military Institute and a historian of early America. He was also an editor of the American Revolutions and the Digital Age volume. After receiving his PhD from Ohio State University, Dr. Boonshoft worked on the Early American Manuscripts Project as a postdoctoral fellow in the New York Public Library's Manuscripts Division. His first book, Aristocratic Education and the Making of the American Republic, was published by the University of North Carolina Press in fall 2020 and was a finalist for the 2021 George Washington Book Prize. So thanks, Mark, for being here. Our two panelists today were co-authors on one chapter in the larger volume. Whitney Stewart is an author, educator, and scholar of Southern history. After receiving her PhD in history from Rice University in 2017, she taught at the University of Texas at Dallas, where she attained tenure in 2024. She's now director of collections and education at Coastal Georgia Historical Society, where she oversees all missions-related activities and leads a team of dedicated public historians. She's also the author of the award-winning This Is Our Home, Slavery and Struggle on Southern Plantations, and co-editor of Race and Nation in the Age of Emancipations, an anthology. Whitney's also published in outlets like Smithsonian Magazine, Time, Winthrop Portfolio, and Journal of the Early Republic. And our second panelist today is Dr. Lindsey Chervinsky. She is a presidential historian and executive director of George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon. Dr. Chervinsky is the author of award-winning books, including Making the Presidency, John Adams, and the Precedents That Forged the Republic, and The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution. And she's also co-editor of Mourning the President's Loss and Legacy in American Culture. Dr. Chervinsky regularly writes for public audiences as well and publications like the Washington Post, Time, USA Today, CNN.com, the Wall Street Journal, and many others, and frequently provides political commentary and historical context for outlets like CBS News, C-SPAN, CNN, News Nation, and NPR's Morning Edition. So thanks again, you all, for being here. Just to get us started, I wanted to give a brief overview of the chapter that Whitney and Lindsey co-edited for those who haven't had a chance to look at that yet. So this session will focus on their co-edited chapter, which was titled Digital Public History at 3 Presidential Home Sites. The chapter considers the process of creating digital products that expand the narratives told at these different presidential homes, which included the President's House in Philadelphia, where George Washington and John Adams both lived, as well as plantations owned by James Madison and James Monroe in Virginia. The digital projects they explore and we'll talk about today at each site, in particular, centered the women and the free and enslaved workers who lived and worked in these homes, and really leads us to ask and engage with the question of whose labor made the Revolutionary Era and its radical ideas possible. The authors show us that the public digital history goals of inclusion and collaboration and shared authority matter, but I really appreciated y'all's honesty about the challenges that also come with those approaches. And I think particularly not to dissuade anyone from taking those approaches, but to prepare us maybe to better accomplish those things. And finally, each site and the digital projects that they engaged with use 3D modeling in different sort of innovative ways to expand those narratives. And I think it's a really great reminder, especially in these current times, of how much place does matter to our understanding of history, and whether that's preserved physically, digitally, or a mix of both. I'm very grateful to hear more about the projects that were discussed in this chapter today. So I will now turn it over to Mark to get the conversation started. Thanks to you all.
Thanks, Jessica. Thanks, Eleanor and Perry and everybody who helped organize this, and thanks to so many of you for joining us on this afternoon. So on page 19, or 18 into 19 of the essay, I know, right? You didn't think that was coming. No, you make a Potter Stewart reference. You say digital public history, which is the first like phrase in the title. Digital public history at presidential home sites. Digital public history is hard to define, as is digital history, as is public history, and we kind of throw up our hands like Potter Stewart said about pornography. You know it when you see it. So we thought we would, as a sort of table setting question, ask you each to sort of think out loud a little bit about how you go about defining public history, digital history, and digital public history in a way that hopefully can set the stage for the conversation. So whoever wants to start, fire away.
Well, this is exactly the question we didn't want to answer, which is why we sidestepped it in the essay altogether, to be fair, because we actually wanted to focus less on the definitional and more on what practices should be defining digital public history. And so those are many that have been mentioned thus far in terms of inclusion, collaboration, shared authority, and user-centered experiences. So I want to kind of step back and say, for us, the definition really wasn't important. I understand that in an academic way, those are, but for practitioners, which both Lindsey and I are now, I think it's even more important to kind of double down on the strategies and then to emphasize what's working and what's not, and to learn from that.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, I think, there are some obvious elements we can kind of rule some things out. So if it's digital, obviously it's not probably going to be like a printed book because that's an older medium. But, I might argue that this collection is inherently sort of a digital history product because it was open source and it was always designed to be open source. So that's sort of one bucket, is that it should have something to do with technology. The second bucket is the public part. So we are not speaking to just our peers in academia or even our peers working at public history sites, but rather trying to reach a broader audience in some fashion. Now, what that looks like, if you ask 100 practitioners, they're going to give you 105 answers. So I think Whitney's point is a really good one, that it's less necessarily about defining what it is or the categories of what it is, and it's more about the approach and the audience and hopefully the engagement.
That's
Yeah,
great.
I think
That was
your
good.
point, Lindsay, that the public part in digital public history is really important, because there are so many incredible digital history projects produced by and for scholars that need to exist in the world, but they don't have to do the same thing that digital public history projects do, and vice versa. We can all be contributing in different ways, and the audience's question. It's something we touch on in the essay, but I think could be developed a bit more, of, who are really asking intentional questions about who do you want your audience to be with this project? Because the public probably is not going to actually be the end result audience. You need to get a little bit more. What are three or four different audiences that you really want to key in on to work with, and then produce this with and for, and that, like, both part there, I think, is important.
No, this is great. Because I think our first conversation, we spent a little bit of time with Ben Wright talking about like kind of the different trajectories of digital history work, and sort of, and it was, I think we got a little inside baseball about sort of the kind of academic side of this, and so the practical is really useful here. And so what I was noticing in rereading your essay is that you do seem to be really influenced by the public history side in ways that came out in your answer. And so I guess when you're talking about shared authority, when you're talking about inclusion, when you're talking about involving more voices and bringing in the public, not just preaching to a public, what does that mean in practice? What's it look like in practice? And kind of maybe before we get to your case studies, which, as Jessica kind of hinted at, you know, have challenges too. What were the examples of projects that gave you kind of inspiration in terms of what works as shared authority in this kind of setting?
Well, I think when we originally wrote this chapter, we would have probably given a different answer than maybe today, because actually one of the projects that I think we found to be really inspiring was the one at Montpelier, because they were working so closely with the descendant community. And that is an incredibly tricky thing for any plantation site, because those relationships are going to be fraught and they're going to be complicated. And the goals of, the different types of shareholders are going to look different. And so we thought that the way that they were doing that really worked well. Now, maybe it has hit some stumbling blocks. It has been a bit of a challenge, and so that is, I think, a really interesting lesson. One other example that I love is George Mason University. So they were trying to figure out how to acknowledge George Mason's, past as an enslaver and as someone who had owned this plantation, yet also recognizing it is not a plantation site. And so it is a university, and how does that shift and evolve? And what they ended up doing, this was around a statue that they have in one of their central squares. And they have a statue of George Mason, and they were trying to figure out how to contextualize that, recognizing that relatively few people, maybe not historians, because historians can't see a plaque and not stop, but relatively few people are going to see a plaque and read it carefully. And so that is often one thing where people will say, oh, well, we can provide information about the enslaved community on a plaque, but that is a limited opportunity. And so what they did around the outside of the square is put up a series of sort of outlines of silhouettes and portraits of people that were enslaved at his home, Gunston Hall, such that you would be able to see through them to the statue, but you also could not miss them. And that was something they did in conjunction with the student community, they did with the university community, with the descendant community near Gunston Hall. And so that project, to me, I think is quite inspiring.
Yeah, one for me that is unlike any that I've seen is kinfolkology. It's created and kind of spearheaded by two historians, and there are two different databases related to enslaved people under the umbrella of kinfolkology. But the idea of kinfolkology is structural parity, which goes back to Montpelier Descendants Committee, and they actually, in the about that I put in the chat, you can see that they actually call them out. And for them, it's about, in some ways, kind of taking down, it's bringing together the history and the descendants, not just the descendants talking about the history and participating in the creation of the database and the maintenance of the database, but saying like, there is no past and present. These things are all one. We are all kind of the kin together. And so it's really beautiful and deeply meaningful database. Like I never thought I would say a database is like beautiful and meaningful, but the work that they are doing to really bring communities together to do this work. And it is, two historians in some ways created it and are leading it, but it's spearheaded by the descendant community. And I don't think it's just because I've worked in the history of slavery as an academic that it will keep bringing up projects relating to the history of slavery. It's because descendants of enslaved people have been pushing public sites and academics and others for so long to take them seriously and to integrate them into the process of history. And finally, over the past couple of decades, sites like Mount Vernon and Monticello and Montpelier have begun to listen and are kind of leading the way in showing others how this work is done.
No, that's great. That actually gets at something I wanted to get at, which is I think one of the things that the chapter does so well is brings together like the history of the founders, the capital F founders, and the other people, enslaved workers, right? Who are in those spaces. And not only is that a new thing to bring together in historic sites, right, in the ways that Whitney you just described, people sort of clamoring for, but it's also kind of in the academic world. These were often pitted as like opposite ends of the spectrum. If you're writing about slavery, you're not writing about the founders, right? They're in the most like in the worst way historiography can develop. So can you share a little bit about your own collaboration, your own sharing authority in writing a chapter together as historians who on the surface, I'm using this just to set up a straw man, but kind of seem to come at the same period from as methodologically distinct approaches as one could imagine, arguably. What that process was like and what you think the benefits were.
Well, so admittedly, we're really good friends, and so any excuse to pretend to be working while also spending time together is is really fun. For me, at least, my initial inspiration when I was working on my first book, actually originally working on my dissertation, which turned into my first book, The Cabinet, I was trying to understand the physical space of the room in which Washington was gathering his executive secretaries, because I felt like it would help me tell a story in a compelling way to be able to describe what they were sitting on and what the table looked like and what did the room feel like, which is the type of narrative writing I really enjoy doing. And the more I dug into that, the more I realized how much this space was affecting the political conversations, the diplomatic conversations, and the developments of really key political movements over the course of the 1790s. And I wasn't seeing that in what we might think of as like traditional political history work. Because as you said, so often the material culture of a space and the political developments happening in the space are treated as two separate buckets. And so I started to dig more into the material culture of the president's house in Philadelphia in the 1790s to be able to flesh out that story. And Whitney was one of the material culture experts that I knew. So I was asking questions about that and trying to get a better understanding for what I should be reading, how materials were used at the time, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't know exactly where it went from there. So maybe I'll allow Whitney to pick up the story and run with it. But for me, at least, that was my motivation of bringing those two things together, of trying to have a better understanding of the arguments I was making and what sort of context I needed to be able to make them well.
I think there's a bit of a generational divide with political historians, and I say this as an outsider, but I never saw Lindsey as thinking as we were actually pursuing some of the same questions, maybe just with different sources, or looking at the same sources with different questions. And so the way that we were working together and bouncing ideas off each other, she She would call me and ask a question about an object. I would call her and be like, what is this political thing that's happening in the 1790s? And so we worked together to understand the history better. And so for me, it was never a barrier. It was such a benefit to have both of our perspectives. And again, they weren't even that different. Lindsey is really the one that got me thinking about the space and the movement of people within these spaces. And I'm coming at it from like the history of slavery. She's coming at it from the history of the cabinet room. And yet she's also thinking of how the enslaved people are moving around. I have to think about the people in the cabinet. So coming together, it built for me a fuller and richer picture of what the president's house might have looked like. And filling out that space when we don't have the physical building anymore to go into, doing that digitally was really, really, one, it was just cool to see it done. And I think it was fruitful from a historical point of view, not just being able to move through it and it being interesting, but actually gleaning these analytical insights from it. So it was kind of out of these conversations just while Lindsey was writing the dissertation and then the book. But we saw the call for papers for the symposium that would go on to become this volume. And we had a panel together and just knew, yes, thank you, Mark, just knew that this would be an opportunity for us to continue those conversations in a more intentional way.
Yeah. I remember, Lindsey, I think it was another Institute for Thomas Paine Studies conference before this one, before the pandemic, where you presented the cabinet room as you had digitally recreated it and just sort of showed how close everybody. And there was like, you don't really get a lot of audible gasps in the history world. And I remember a kind of audible gasp in the room. It's kind of like when Eric Foner walks into an archive. That's the only other time I've heard it. And I remember being like, wow, like the intervention that did was just instantaneously available and visualizable in a way. But one of the things that the chapter gets at is that this is actually like your collaboration was really fruitful, right? You've just described that, but it was also challenging. And
Yeah.
so the President's House case study, because that was the one that you both worked on most directly, I thought maybe we would talk about that one a little bit. But what were the challenges with trying to recreate a space that didn't exist, both in terms of that problem, but also the problem of doing the digital public history work in the intentional way you described?
Well, at least I think there were a couple of challenges. Actually, like finding the materials was the relatively easy part because Washington was such a control freak. He really had left so many written documents about what the space looked like and how the house was structured and organized, and down to like he wrote letters about what color drapery should be in the hallway. Like the level of detail is extraordinary. I think there were sort of three challenges. The first is that we are both historians. We are not video game designers. We do not have coding experience. And so you would inherently need to bring in at least one third partner to try and actually do that building work, which then leads to the second challenge, which is funding. That work is expensive. And that leads to the third challenge, which is sort of a host site for it. Funding is a lot easier if you have an institution who is really behind it. But where we were in our careers, we were quite transitory. So we were, changing our jobs, we were going different places, and so we couldn't necessarily commit to leaving a project in one spot if we were going to be moving and wanting to take it with us. And so trying to find those three factors together, the additional knowledge and expertise, the funding to make it happen, and where it would live and under what umbrella it would live were incredibly difficult. And then I would just say, going forward, even if we thought it was so interesting and we wanted to continue the work, our careers kind of took us in different directions. And so it became less central to our daily profession and therefore less of a sort of priority. And we all in the public history space have to juggle priorities.
Yeah, I found the trying to find the right people in the computer science gaming world. And I was at a university that has an exceptional computer science and gaming departments. But I found it difficult to be able to articulate in the language for them to convince them of why this mattered. And I think the funding could have come if that chasm was a little bit less extreme. I just remember having these conversations about what we wanted to do, which of course we don't know if it's even possible. So there's the chasm there because they're like, who are these idiots that think that you can do this with this kind of technology? And then on our end, we're like, who are these idiots who think that, this needs to emphasize this history and is going to look like that, and it's going to be for these audiences. And I'm sorry, I'm being a little extreme. Like, no one was calling each other idiots. But there is just something about that, the disconnect between the humanities and the technology side, that at least for where we were in our careers at this time, we couldn't bring those together. And spoiler alert, the President's House project is defunct. So, it's out there if anyone wants to take up the mantle. We would be happy to pass it along, but it became too difficult to be able to continue.
And there's a theme here, which is we talked about this in the last conversation. There's a theme in all the projects you reference here, that there have been challenges in continuing the projects. And so I'll frame this question sort of broadly, so that way you can either reference some of the other projects in here or beyond. But what other of the kind of challenges do you see to the long-term efficacy of digital public history work? I mean, we've got funding, we've got collaboration challenges, and we've got servers and logistical things like where do you house stuff. But what other kinds of cautionary tales have you seen in your work over the last decade?
Well, building off of the third piece, the servers and the technical details, that stuff is changing all of the time, and it's changing fast. And AI is just kind of coming onto the scene in terms of our field, in terms of thinking about how that will impact things. So one of the challenges to thinking about longevity for these projects is, how do you ensure that it won't break? How do you ensure that it could be transferable from one program to another? How do you ensure that it is transferable, or it is something that you can keep going as staff might change out? So, who is responsible for retaining that institutional knowledge? And I think there are a couple of ways that you can, I don't want to just be negative. So I also want to offer up some potential solutions here. There are some digital history projects that are really designed to have a short lifespan, or what I would think of as short. So maybe it's designed for 3 years. There's nothing wrong with that. You just want to be really clear about what your goal and your intentions are. Others, you maybe want to have a longer lifespan. And so then you need to have maybe an institution that is the primary driver, or funder, or at least home, and then the people who are kind of coming in and out of that that institution can contribute, but it will ensure its longevity. So one, for example, that we have here at Mount Vernon is called Argo. It's the American Revolutionary Geographies Online, and we have built that in partnership with the Leventhal Center in Boston. And what's beneficial about that is, as we have had staff turnover, I can put that link in the chat, as we have had staff turnover, it's the institution is what's backing it, and so we can have new people coming in. And so I think that there are workarounds to these challenges. They're just something you have to be really mindful of when you're planning out the project.
Yeah, I want to make 2 points. One, these kinds of projects would work better if graduate programs would do things like include a class on project management or something. I'm now in this position where it would be very useful for my current job, but it would have been very useful for my previous job as a professor, and doing this kind of collaborative work and being able to develop a plan and a budget, and to know how to really know how to flesh out all of the elements. I think we can sometimes take on these projects so excited, and then they dissolve because we don't have a strong plan in place, because we didn't learn how to do that. So I want to kind of put a call out there to, master's and PhD programs in history and public history and museum studies to make sure that we're able to do the kind of project management work that these projects necessitate. And second, building on Lindsey's point, I don't want us always to think that these things have to live forever, because they can't, first of all, but also they can be like drafts of writing, right? So, I mean, you have to write the bad drafts. You have to write the 10th draft, the 20th draft of something to get to the final one. And I see, for instance, at Highland, their AR tour that they developed is no longer in existence. They don't have the cool technology, but that was formative for the work that they've done for their now physical exhibit that they have on the site. So that was a part of the historical process. We think about writing in this way, and maybe we can also think about digital projects in this way too. It's just a part of the process.
I love that
I
answer.
also think just as one more point on that, when we're thinking about like an in-person exhibit, we don't expect an in-person exhibit to stay in a museum for 50 years.
Yeah.
And if it did, it would be horrifically outdated. And so, a museum, depending on the museum, a lifespan of an exhibit can be, not very long. And so I think that it's important for us to think in those flexible terms.
Yeah, that was exactly what I was thinking when Whitney was talking, was right. We don't expect those to be to live forever. One thing we do expect or hope for, and Ben talks about this in the intro to the volume, and this came up in the first webinar, but that access and accessibility is an important, in theory, feature of digital work, right? Both literally, you don't have to be somewhere physically the way you would for a traditional public history project that is place-based. Also, the internet affords us, tools to make things accessible for in other ways. But some of the things that we've been talking about are like just not exactly the most accessible. Like Whitney, you described being amazed that you could think a database was beautiful. So what,
Yeah.
and like that is that's a hard thing to do. So how do you make these kind of digital projects, which are obviously to create, take a whole lot of technical know-how, and sometimes to manipulate can take a lot of technical know-how. I'm thinking actually like right now of the slave trade database, which is incredibly powerful, but there's a lot of parameters to work with. So like, how do you go about thinking about databases and other public digital public projects that are actually user friendly and accessible, and kind of what are the sort of common denominators between them?
I think there are a couple of questions you have to ask yourself. So the first is, it goes back to this audience question. Who are you hoping will actually use this project? If your answer is students versus people at a historic site, that answer is going to look quite different. And then I think the second piece of that is sort of the place of usage. So again, if it's at a particular site, then that is going to limit what you're going to be able to offer, as opposed to if you're trying to reach people online. So let me give you an example with this President's House project. We were thinking when we had our most grandiose ideas, what I wanted was for people to be able to go to the MPS site, which is in Philadelphia now, which shows a small portion of the floor plan of the house. And that was, I think that they did the best that they could with the options that they had, because there were already other things built on top of the existing floor plan, and NPS doesn't rebuild sites. But so I wanted for people to be able to like pull up their phones and like hold up the phone and it to show the house as it would have looked as you were in that space. That raises a lot of questions of, is that an app? If someone has to download an app, that's an obstacle a lot of people aren't going to do. If it's a website, will it be functional when you're actually doing the space? If it's a QR code, is that going to break? So there are a lot of different questions about usage, audience, and place that are essential to understanding, I think, how you want to make something accessible and available to people. And generally, the fewer obstacles, the better. So the fewer apps, the fewer programs, of course, money and cost, those are all things, but the fewer obstacles, the better.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about the difference between visitation and engagement. and I've been thinking about it at physical museums, but I think that there's something here too. So when we're talking about users, are they going to your digital public history project and just kind of exploring? Or are they going back again and again and again and again and again? And the latter, this isn't digital public history per se, but what I was thinking about a database or a digital project relating to history that is user friendly, that is used by millions of people and is used by those individuals many times. It's Ancestry. So what is Ancestry doing right? Because they also gamify some things, right? They allow for discovery. And this is something that American Association of State and Local Histories Reframing History report talked about. If you haven't read that report, I highly recommend it. It's on their website. But one of the things that they emphasize, and when you're trying to convince people about what history actually is, like what do historians do? It's about detective work. It's about that process of investigation and discovery. And I think that's actually something that Ancestry does really well, that if we want more engagement and not just visitation, that digital public history sites can incorporate better.
That's great. So I want to, I have like one and a half more questions depending on how much we get in the Q&A. But one of these is, and one of you alluded to this earlier, that you might have written some of this differently if you were in the seats you're in now compared to where you were then. You've talked a bit about, the peripatetic lifestyle of an early career academic. You got moved around a lot, but when this, I think, was drafted, if I'm remembering correctly, Whitney, maybe you had just started at UT Dallas, and Lindsey, I think you were at Monticello on a research fellowship, but you were both sort of more in the kind of academic side of this, overly siloed profession that we have, and now you're both in public history sites. This is not to say neither you both had your feet in the public history world well before, but I think that maybe just the perspective of workplace does have some impact on how you think about these projects. So what would you have maybe written differently, or how do you think a little bit differently about some of the concepts in particular in this volume, in the chapter about digital public history, given your kind of shifting professional situations?
Whit, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna kind of expose myself here, but I found it way easier to focus more on myself and what I needed when I was an academic and what I wanted from a project versus now I feel much more beholden to the audiences that I am serving. And I think maybe that's the word. I'm serving
Yeah.
the public rather than giving something to the public. I just feel that a little bit more deeply now than I did before. I think that's probably I wanna do more for public rather than just like, yeah, do more with, less for, I guess.
I think I have a couple of takeaways. I think the first is I had some ideas about what I thought the public wanted and needed. And on one hand, I was 100% correct. Like a lot of my interactions with the public have been total confirmation that I was spot on certain things. On the other, I think it has forced me to think a little bit more with more nuance about what I mean by public, because here at Mount Vernon, we have multiple different publics. We have the scholars that come in and do research in the library. We have the well-educated adults that are generally most of the people that attend our public programming. And then we have the thousands upon thousands of eighth graders that come through as part of their school trip to Washington, D.C. And those are all very different groups of people that we all serve. And so I think I did have to think with a little bit more nuance. The second piece that I think that I hinted at this in the essay, or we hinted at this in the essay, and I certainly have addressed it in the question, but thinking about the institutional stakeholders, in addition to the public stakeholders, is often much more nuanced because you have funders and donors, or if you get a lot of government funding, we've seen obviously how that can affect things. If you have boards, if you have other partners within the institution, you know, whether it's your education team or your media team or your development team, you have a boss. Those are things that I think I conceptually understood and certainly I think nodded to, but those are all going to be people who have a say or at least have an opinion. And so often, you know, that can make the process, I think, a little bit, I think it can make it better because I do believe sometimes that having more eyeballs on a project is a good thing, but it also can make it a little bit more complicated. And so that I think would be one of the takeaways I would have certainly at a site that has all those types of players, I would have addressed more.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a great question in the chat, so I'm just I'll jump jump over to that one. But if other people have questions, please start throwing them in. I've asked enough, even though I have more in the tank. But this question is that so much public history at historic sites is place or object based. How do you try to bring the weight of place into digital projects, and how much does the audience perhaps miss by simply accessing a digital project and not experiencing a site? And I think this is a great question for both of you. But I mean, I know I've been at the Washington's tomb at Mount Vernon too many times to count, and also the memorial to the enslaved people that is not far from it. And those are really heavy places, differently heavy for different people. But I think like this is a great question for the both of you. Whitney, I'm sorry, I haven't been to coastal Georgia yet. You just got there though.
Just wait.
Just wait. There's time.
Yeah, well, like we should not expect digital projects to do what places and physical objects can. So like let's just start there. We need all of these types of historical experiences. I think that the digital can, like Lindsey's dream for what the president's house could be, is reflective of the AR experience at Highland, right? So it adds to what you are experiencing at a place. Because we all know as historians, you go to a historic site and it has changed dramatically from 150 years ago in the way that people experience that, right? There are trees where there would have been no trees. There are buildings where there would have been fields. And so we can use technology to actually give us a more historical sense of a place. So don't expect it to do the same thing, but also they can complement one another.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, there is no replacing place. There's a power that comes with it, and often to demonstrate that when I'm giving a talk, I will show a picture of myself when I was 7 at Jamestown in the steel helmet and armor as a demonstration of how visiting these places as a kid can really make them come alive for you. And so I don't think, to Whitney's point, I don't think we should ever expect them to replace or to change. What I do think it can do is it can make the place slightly more accessible to those who can't get there. So, for example, we're working on a project now, working in tandem with our education team, where we offer a teacher institute. Teachers come to Mount Vernon, they have the opportunity to learn from the space, and we actually call it place-based learning, but not all teachers can come. And so we're building up sort of a module system of one of our teacher institutes. And one of those is how do you use the space for teaching? And we're doing a whole thing on Washington's study in the Mansion House, and looking at the documents and looking at the items that were there and the furniture and what did this say about what he wanted from the space and who he was meeting with. And that is going to be a digital project. It is going to be available online. It will be free to teachers. Is it the same thing as being in the room? No, it's not. You can't smell the wood. You can't, smell the books and the leather. You can't hear how the floor creaks when you walk across the boards, but it's certainly better than nothing. And so I think as we're at an era where we're trying to think about accessibility and reaching people who maybe can't come to everything or who are limited, that is worth fighting for because it is certainly better than nothing. And I think that accessibility piece is so important.
I also wonder, so as someone that has studied historic plantation sites and knowing that the majority of historic plantations are privately owned, there is a question here about like, not only what can people access because they, can't drive the distance to Mount Vernon, but also, is this space even accessible to the public? Because what are we missing as historians that we can't see? So, and I have no idea what this would look like in terms of a digital project, but perhaps that is one way that the digital could help us, is that we could gain insight into places that the public is not allowed.
Yeah, that's a great point. We have another question in the Q&A from a self-identified emerging public historian who's in the initial surveying phase of a digital public history project. And they ask what strategies can be employed to engage communities or intended audiences in ways that are authentic and mutually beneficial, particularly given the potential for digital platforms to diminish interpersonal connection, right, in ways we could have experienced, but and also in ways that can sometimes lead to kind of extractive practices. So how do you avoid the kind of extractive practices? And I think this is a really important question that I know both of you have dealt with, that I would give a hat tip to some other essays in the volume, especially Sarah Collini's about, and Ben Bankhurst and Kyle Roberts is about, trying to avoid datafication of humanity, so of humans. So I think this is a great question. I'll turn it over to both of you.
Yeah, well, I will admit this is the part that I still find the most uncomfortable, because you obviously want to include all of the stakeholders, and you want to do so in a way that is respectful and authentic to their experience, but you also don't want to be asking them to do the work for you. And so that question is really hard. And so I think there are a couple of steps you can take, although this isn't in perfect practice. One, do as much research as you can before reaching out. If they have, let's say it's a tribe, if they have a tribal history, like read the materials they have already put out that they've made available. If there are scholars that they recognize as experts on their story, read that material, such that you're not coming from a place of zero. You're coming from a place of having already done effort, and you can demonstrate that you're making a good faith effort to learn from their wisdom. I think the second piece is be, as honest as possible about what you're working on and that you would like to include them in it, but also don't expect them to say yes. I think the third piece is you have to be prepared either for silence, for non-engagement, or even for criticism, because people are not obligated to participate. And instead, sometimes they don't want to. And so I think that is just part of the work. And that is true for whether you're talking about a white community, a Native community, a Black community, whoever it is, they're not necessarily going to want to participate. So the best thing you can do is try and put in a good faith effort to show that you've tried.
Yeah, and I think maybe the users of digital public history can't physically go to places, but if you are going to create a digital project about a community's history, you have to go there. That's an absolute have to do. This wasn't a digital project, but I was part of a historic context survey to assess whether St. John the Baptist Parish was eligible for a National Historic Landmark. And we created a community meeting, which was wonderful and well attended. But where we learned the most was going to church, multiple different churches, going to the little restaurants and grabbing some lunch with people, driving around with folks. It's that personal, individual connection that makes people feel perhaps you are less likely to screw them over than the people that were trying to do this thing before. They still might not want to participate, but that's okay. You also gain something in the process of being in these places and with these people that will be beneficial to your project, regardless of what they very understandably decide to do.
Others in the Q&A, so I'll pivot here. This is completely a sort of 180 from this. We're all gearing up for the 250th of American independence in one way or another. How do you think digital public history, in the way that you've described it in this essay, can aid that season of commemoration to hopefully do a good job at it this time around for the 250th?
Well, I think one of the challenges going into next year is that we are facing a very different media ecosystem than 1976 or 1876 or anything like that. We don't just have three TV channels. We don't sort of have standard radio stations we listen to. And so that both makes it more difficult because there are so many digital options, but I think also it makes digital required because so many people are not getting their information, whether it's cultural information, historical information, news information, they're not getting it from what we would consider to be sort of the standard platforms. Instead, they're on TikTok or they're watching YouTube or they're listening to podcasts. And so all of those in one form or another, I think could be, I don't know that they're all history, but they're certainly all digital and could have a really interesting digital history component. And so I think um, digital is essential in a way that it hasn't been before. It also introduces a lot more challenges, but it is absolutely essential.
And especially since there are several states that do not even have a 250 commission, Texas and California, right? And Georgia just got one a couple months ago and it's no funding, right? So that's one thing is that there's, in some ways, we as historical organizations are expected to do all of this around 250, and yet there's no funding to assist us in developing these programs. And not to say that the digital is always cheaper, but it usually is. And so we have to utilize whatever we can in this moment where so many of us feel strapped and yet desirous of taking advantage of this once in a lifetime opportunity as historians.
We've got two strategy questions in the Q&A. One from Bobby Keith, who says, we're building a digital public history and education tool for the National Mall for the 250th, and was asking if you guys have advice. And then the other question it was about the nuances of working with institutional audiences and what strategies have you found to be successful in garnering support for digital public history projects. So I think we can maybe take both of those together, the sort of specific 250 and the National Mall, but also the strategies for getting buy-in on those types of projects in particular, digital public history projects, that is.
First of all, the National Mall America 250, amazing. Can't wait to see what y'all create. I do, just as someone who's been in the kind of full-time public history mode for 4 months now, I can't tell you how important relationships and collaborations are. Just asking anyone you know, hey, what do you think? And do you have any models that you might share with me? Here I am over here in coastal Georgia, and it's hurricane season, and I had to write a hurricane plan. I had no idea what I was doing. And so I asked everyone that I knew that might have a hurricane plan because they lived on a coast and they work in a historical organization. And that kind of just really taking advantage of your public history community, however lame it might be, posting on Facebook and LinkedIn, people will give you so many good ideas that you didn't anticipate. And so just relying on your colleagues to really help give you advice and guidance and models from which you can, because I have no idea. I mean, this is a really big undertaking and I can't wait to see it, but I don't have any specific advice other than there probably are other people that do have specific advice to give.
Mark, can you tell me the first question again?
The first question was about advice on the 250th on the National Mall, and then the second question was about advice on navigating getting institutional buy-in for digital public history projects.
Yeah, so for the National Mall, one of the things that I have been pushing that I think is really important is for a lot of younger people in particular, a founding legacy feels the founding generation feels quite dated and distant and not particularly accessible to them because of the way it has often been described and taught as this glorious thing that people should aspire to and was created by these geniuses, and that just doesn't necessarily feel useful to a lot of people today. I think if we look at a founding legacy of one where highly imperfect people trying to create something that would last, but recognizing constantly their pitfalls and their flaws and embracing a spirit of innovation and change. They wrote the Articles of Confederation and threw them out less than 10 years later. They drafted the Constitution and wrote a Bill of Rights less than 2 years later. They, continued to amend and to change. And it was not because they thought they had created a perfect thing, but rather they were trying to move forward this idea of each step would be slightly more perfect. And they fully expected future generations to do so. And it is only recently that we have started to view this thing as something that is carved into granite and cannot be changed. And so, to me, that is a legacy that is much more useful. It is much more interesting, is much more exciting because it empowers each generation to try and do more. I welcome it to you if it's useful to you as a legacy to think about sharing, because I think it might feel a little bit more tangible to people that are coming. And it is certainly the legacy that I'm going to be exploring in the coming years. In terms of outreach, I would say think as diverse as possible about your platforms of outreach, because and also I would say do not be afraid of being repetitive, because you would be surprised if you post things online, a very small portion of your audience is going to see them. So, repeat, continue to ask, as Whitney said, but then also think really, really broadly about how you might reach different people. So, every channel you can think of, word of mouth, emails, everything, that broadness, I think, is essential.
Something else in the Q&A. So I'll throw one more out there. I mean, we have at least one aspiring public historian, as they put it in the their question. But so you guys had to both sort of figure out this path for yourselves, right? You were in PhD programs in at research universities, and then had to kind of you've carved these careers over the last decade and change. What would you have liked to have had in graduate school? I mean, Whitney, you mentioned like project management, but beyond that, like the kind of habits of mind and skill sets that you've both talked about utilizing over the course of this conversation, like what would you want to have in a grad course, or like a grad, colloquium on how to do something like this if you were designing from scratch some sort of, uh, a broader training platform for humanities graduate students in history?
Well, so I personally benefited from doing about 8 years of public speaking and theater in high school and college. And it has been my hobby horse that we as a profession do not really prioritize public speaking, and yet our jobs are to speak to humans all the time. And that drives me crazy, because if I'm listening to someone speak and they can't make eye contact, I'm going to dismiss what they're saying, because I'm not taking seriously the presentation of the information. And so I always felt that was really an essential thing that graduate programs were missing, is the presentation really matters of the material. Just like we wouldn't throw up an Excel spreadsheet as like a super, messy thing and say, here's my finished product. We would try and create a beautiful database. That is one thing. What I would have really loved is like I can do my own personal budget, but I now deal with a complex budget. And so more budget, like math. I know historians don't like math. It's really important. You have to know how to have a budget, and a long-term budget that have a lot of different complicated pieces. So, and as part of that, perhaps like grant planning and what that looks like. So I think there really should be like a, history finances 101, and have a whole thing on budgets and grants and how you actually plan that and make that work, and what do endowments mean, and what do drawdowns mean, and what are like all of these things that you do not necessarily need to do if you are, I mean, you obviously have to do some of them if you're a professor, but there's a lot of that type of work that you have to learn the language on the fly if you don't have that training.
Yeah, and I want to say that I started my PhD program a dozen years ago, and so maybe things have changed dramatically and have improved, but there's still, I mean, but I was at a university for 7 years, so I can tell you that it hasn't. And that it doesn't matter what we do, the professoriate who is teaching you is always going to privilege professor jobs. And they're going to assume that that's what you want to be, even if you tell them that you're interested in museum work. And they're not going to create a curriculum that makes it easy for you to substitute public history or museum study classes for history classes. And so what do I think we need to have more flexibility. We know the statistics about the number of history PhDs who are searching for and do not end up in professoriate positions. We actually don't know as much about how many are not searching because they know that's not what they want to do. But both of those groups together outweigh the people who go into academia. And so we have to allow for folks who are needing the business, nonprofit experience, museum studies, budgets, public speaking, project management, all of these various writing for non-academic audiences. It's all of these things could be taught and could be incorporated into curriculum fairly easily. But professors who are in professorial positions are not necessarily the ones maybe that are going to make that change. So I know I'm not the first person to make this argument. I'm not going to be the last, but we have to keep talking about it because at some point change has to be made at the curriculum level for master's and PhD programs and bachelor's programs in history.
Yeah. I would just add to that. I think Whitney's point is such a good one. And the problem is, of course, that like within history departments, you have all history professors. So even if they necessarily value the work, they don't necessarily have those skills. And so, it is incumbent upon departments who have alumni who have done this work to try and bring them back, to try and help. And I intentionally cast that as shade that many do not. And that is shocking to me.
And that's poor alumni development. There's an opportunity there. I mean, yeah.
The first time I hear from you should not be asking me for a donation. Like this is a very clear 101 alumni development.
Yeah.
So somebody did throw in the chat, universities could hire more retired or fired public historians to teach. And I think everybody on this would agree with that. And then I think there's probably some old guy who's like, but then what will happen to my graduate seminar on the French Revolution? And therein lies the problem. And I know Eleanor and Jessica have come back on the screen to tell us that we are out of time. And so before I hand it off to them, just thank you both for the essay, which is really wonderful, and for all your thoughtful comments, and to the audience members for all the great questions. And I will shut up.
Thank y'all.
Well, let me just echo what Mark said and thank, Lindsey, Whitney, Mark, and also Jessica for coming here today and having this amazing discussion. It was just so rich. And I said this after our last session, but Jessica and I are hoping to capture these as video recordings, but also maybe in a podcast form at some point too, because these discussions have just been so rich. We want as many people as possible to have access. And I want to thank all the attendees here today. We'll have our next session, Slavery, Freedom, and Resistance, on Wednesday, July 9th at 3 p.m. So please register for that. Panelists will discuss how digital humanities expands our understanding of freedom in the revolutionary period. And you will get a follow-up email about this session in a couple of days. So we'll have a link to the recording, and then you can find a recording from the last session also on that link. I think that Jessica posted, or we posted earlier, to Living Landscape Observer. So again, thank you so much to our panelists, and I hope everyone has a great afternoon, and we hope to see you on July 9th. So thank you so much. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, y'all. Thanks.
Bye.